Hi, Prince Street Church. Pastor John here. I'm coming to you today because this last Sunday, June 26th, was the third week of our series on the Sermon on the Mount called The Way of Jesus. And if you were able to join us or you watched online, you know that I was feeling a little bit under the weather. I was dealing with a chest cold and my voice sounded awful. And sorry for that. I decided during the first service that morning that I was going to re-record this message later this week so that people can rewatch it if they missed anything due to my voice, and so that people who missed Sunday are able to watch something that sounds not as grating to their ears. So let's get into that message, and because it's an important one, talking about salt and light, and I don't want people to miss what God really has to say through this message just due to my voice. So let's get into the message this morning. I want you to think back on the last time you saw a Christian or a church in the news, especially the national news. Was it for a good thing or a bad thing? If I had to bet, I bet it was for a not so good thing. Whether it's churches hiding abuses and abuse of people in their churches, or churches making power grabs by connecting with politicians, or maybe it's another prominent Christian leader caught in a sex scandal. You know, it's a mess. It's a shame. Mostly because of the contrast with how Jesus described what the church should be. And also because if you're not a Christian, if you don't really know any real Christians, and you think this guy that's in the news is a representative of all Christians, then you're going to likely end up thinking that Christianity is a joke. So Jesus, he touches on all these ideas in our passage today, which is Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. So even if you're joining us today online, feel free to turn in your Bibles or pull it up on your smartphones. Of course, like I mentioned before at the beginning of the video, we're in week 3 of a series called The Way of Jesus. And we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus teaches his followers about life in his kingdom. Really teaching them to live like him and to value what he values. And so today, in this passage here in Matthew chapter 5, we're going to unpack a lot of what Jesus intends for us to be as a church. So I'm going to read the whole passage, and then I'm going to take some time to break it down for us. So starting with verse 13, Jesus says that you are the salt of the earth. But the salt loses its saltiness. How can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Move on to verse 14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stands and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Well, the key thing from this passage is that Jesus calls his followers salt and light. And he calls his followers salt and light. And the first thing I really want to point out to you in this passage is all the way back in verse 13, the first verse here. And it's even the first word. What's that first word in verse 13? The first word is you. And there's a significant weakness of our English language that you is both the singular and plural second person pronoun. Whether you're addressing a crowd or one single person, either way, the proper English word is you. So we could easily, while reading through this passage, make the mistake of thinking that Jesus is addressing us as individuals here. That he's saying you, individual Christian, are the salt of the world, or salt of the earth. That you, the individual follower of Jesus, are the light of the world. But this is wrong. And you, individual Christian, are not the salt, nor are you the light of the world by yourself. In this little light of mine, which is catchy, it's a cute song, this little light of mine, it's a lie. It is this little light of ours, together. Now, the English language, suffers from this weakness. And this is actually not a weakness at all for folks down south. People in the South, when they address a group of people, they say y'all, right? They say y'all. I have a friend who grew up around here, but moved down south right after college, and she only lived there for a few years before moving back up. But she had this southern accent down, and she definitely brought back the word y'all, and used it a lot in her vocabulary. You see, y'all is a much better word to use here, and also a lot of other times in the Bible too. And you know what? There's actually a website out there that reminds us of this. It's actually called y'allversion.com. Y'allversion.com. And it changes all the plural used to y'all. Actually, you actually go through and change it too by region. If you want kind of the general United States, it replaces all the plural used with you all. You can change it to Western United States. It changes it all to you guys. To New York City, it's yous guys. And even Pittsburgh dialect, it's yins. Yins. Again, it's a good word out there. But anyway, this is what Jesus is saying here if you would use the southern dialect. He's saying, y'all are the salt of the earth. Y'all are the light of the world. And we know this to be true for 3 reasons. The first verses in Matthew chapter 5 that we talked about the other week says that Jesus is teaching his disciples and a larger crowd. That he's addressing a big y'all. And then reason number 2, right after talking about salt and light, the next thing that Jesus says is that there's a town built on a hill that cannot be hidden. So I want you to just even picture right now, if you will, an empty town with one lone man in the street screaming, I am the city of salt and light. I am the city of salt and light. Well, no, sir, you're not. You need some help. You're not a one-man town. The beauty of a town is many people working together. And also the reason number 3, in case you're not convinced, the Greek here, the Greek word for you is plural. There's plural nouns and plural verbs. It's y'all, not you as individual. So whatever Jesus is saying here about salt and light, his instructions are for y'all, not a you. Okay, so what is Jesus really saying here? So let's go back to verse 13. And I want to encourage you to add the southern dialect here for some clarity. We'll read it for you too. So verse 13, it says, y'all are the salt of the earth. But the salt loses its saltiness. How can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And that's verse 13. Well, today we mainly use salt for flavor, don't we? But in the first century world, salt was also used as a preservative. There was no refrigeration, so if you wanted your meat to last longer than the day you killed that animal, you had to salt it. So salt, it would preserve the meat as it flavors the meat. It would prevent rot and decay from the meat happening. So anyways, let's move into verse 14 now. Verse 14 and 15. Jesus says, y'all are the light of the world. A town on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. So here's the picture that Jesus is painting. Salt, in verse 13, is about this inner composition. Salt preserves the meat's internal integrity. While light, on the other hand, it's about an outward display. Light shines, pushing darkness and helping everyone in the house to see clearly. So together, salt and light prevent decay and darkness. Jesus says that you together as the church are to be salt and light, that you together are to prevent decay and darkness. Again, this is what Jesus calls his people to be, inwardly transformed by his love, by his grace, by his word, by his spirit. And as a result, we become a town or a city of light on display. That we're inwardly transformed by his love, which causes us to be a city of light on display. He makes this even more clear in verse 16, where Jesus says, in the same way, let y'all's light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So I want to take some time just right now to unpack what that phrase good deeds means in this verse. There are two Greek words that can be used for good. One is agathos, which means of good or high quality. And the second one is kalos, which means beautiful. And in this passage, actually the word kalos is used. That Jesus, he actually intends for his followers' communal life, this community life together to be beautiful. That our works as a town on a hill is to be beautiful. It's to shine brightly. It's full of beautiful, shiny deeds that reflect his love. It's supposed to draw people's attention to God, not to ourselves, but to God. And in this regard, in a negative situation that we can find ourselves in, say, like the post-pandemic world that we're in, today can be an opportunity for the church to shine its brightest. In our world today, post-pandemic, people are still struggling. Mental health is struggling. Anxiety and depression are still up. Alcohol use is still way up. And people are grasping at ways to cope with all this stuff that's going on in our world today. We as Christians are too. We're struggling with everything that we've experienced over these last 2 years. But in the midst of our negative situations, you and I, we have the resources to draw near to God and to be filled with his joy in the midst of the negative circumstances that we find ourselves in. And with that joy, we can go out into our neighborhoods and our jobs and our schools asking, how can I be a blessing here? How can I lift others up? Who can I encourage? How can I bring Jesus' beautiful kingdom here in my midst? When we bring God's joy to the world around us, it's a beautiful thing. It's us being salt and light. With all that being said, back in verse 13, Jesus also mentions a potential problem for this beauty. In verse 13, Jesus says, y'all are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, this is the key right here. The salt loses its saltiness. How can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. Over time and through use, salt can actually become unsalty salt. And you know what? Unsalty salt, it's useless. It's lost its flavor, its ability to preserve, it's lost its ability to prevent rot and decay. And in the day when Jesus was sharing this, they would throw it out in the streets to get trampled on with the mud and trash. Everyone just walked on over. This unsalty salt was useless. It had no value whatsoever. And if I'm to be honest, I say that Jesus' picture of unsalty salt here describes way too much of the Christian faith today. It's not just the scandals and the headlines, although those are pictures of unsalty Christians getting discredited and trampled on like Jesus said they would. But even more so, the average person in America who says they're following Jesus, but nothing in their life looks like him. That no internal life change, no, they have an unsalty salt, and no external display of his glory, beauty, no light being shined. One researcher named Michael Horton describes this unsaltiness in this way. He says evangelical Christians are as likely to embrace lifestyles every bit as hedonistic, materialistic, self-centered, and sexually immoral as the world in general. This is a massive issue if Jesus says that we're supposed to be salt and light in the world. And that doesn't really read like salt and light. And so I just want to take some time not this morning, but whenever you're watching this, to share about some of the reasons why this might be happening. First, at some point in this move towards unsalty salt, the American church has become fascinated with growth or just being big. A wave of well-intentioned churches wanted to import business and marketing ideals in order to reach people far from Jesus. In and of themselves, not a terrible idea. But church growth categories become a monster. It's become its own genre of books and leadership conferences, and everyone began to measure their church's value based on its size. But that idea that the bigger something is, the more valuable it is, that's an American idea. It's not a Jesus idea. This concept that bigger equals better is more in line with the American life, not Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that a small church is better than a big one. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. There are plenty of big churches out there that are doing amazing things for the kingdom. They are living out this call from Jesus to be salt and light to the world around them. Of course, there's also plenty of small churches that are just dying or already dead, that they lost their saltiness years ago and they're just going through the motions. But the problem is evaluating success on size rather than being salt and light. If a church is more worried about how many people show up to a worship service on a Sunday morning than what their body of Christ is doing out in the world the other 6 days of the week, then they may cut corners on fighting to see people's lives actually changed by the gospel. A church needs to be more focused on being a salt and light community, not just being a big community for being big's sake. Even in churches our size, we have to fight to have groups where people can really know each other and to help each other grow in their faith. For us as individuals, it's so easy for us to hide in a crowd, to appear godly, nod along with the teaching, sing some songs, all without letting anyone know you enough to help you grow. This is why I believe it's so important to be part of a Sunday school class or a ministry team here at Prince Street Church. That we have to get into these small intentional places to become the salt and light community that Jesus is talking about. Now, of course, that's one thing. There's churches that don't necessarily focus on being big, but instead they focus entirely too much on knowledge. That this spiritual maturity gets defined by the amount of facts that you know. And this can be tough to really diagnose because knowledge in and of itself is not necessarily bad. But if it doesn't lead to life change, then we aren't becoming what Jesus said we are to be, salt and light. Jesus defines maturity not by how much you know, but by how much you grow. Or you can say it like this: Jesus defines maturity not by the answers that you give, but by how you live. Again, these are things that rhyme, so they're catchy, but they're also accurate. Another researcher, his name is George Barna. He summed up American Christianity over the last 70 years in this way. He says, American Christianity has largely failed since the middle of the 20th century because Jesus' modern-day disciples do not act like Jesus. Of course, that's the problem. They don't know how to live in the way of Jesus. They're not a salt and light community that reflects Him to the glory of God. The problem isn't knowing things. Having your mind filled with God's Word is actually a prerequisite for a changed life. To some degree, we all need to read and learn a lot more in order to renew our minds and think more like Christians rather than Americans. But the point remains, if what we're learning doesn't lead us to life and to change, then we're missing it. Okay, so those are for us, more to do with how churches can end up making unsalty salt. I just want to give you one more thing this morning that's more focused on you and me as individual Christians. And there's this constant temptation that we face to approach our Christian faith like a consumer. To kind of show up Sunday morning or Wednesday night or wherever to a church service with our hands out saying, okay, thank you. But the spiritual goods in my service is right here. And that's the sum total of our faith. Sorry about that. Again, we can do that through our teaching. We can say, oh, I like the sermon. They said what I wanted to hear. We can do that with the music. This church or this service plays the type of music that I want to listen to and sing to. I like that. I enjoy that. We can do it with programs. What does this program really do to meet the needs for my family? Or how does this program make me feel? We can even do it with our communities. We can do it, treat our Sunday school classes and our small groups like they exist to meet my wants and preferences instead of realizing those things really exist to shape me into being salt and light. And this whole series that we're walking through these over the next couple months on the Sermon on the Mount, the way of Jesus, Jesus is calling us as a collective whole in the exact opposite direction of consumerism. He's calling us to lay down our selfishness and to be transformed by his self-sacrifice, to operate with a whole different set of priorities, to be a people who don't get caught up in the panic and anxiety of the kingdom of this world, a people who make peace wherever we go because we know the Prince of Peace, a people who embody deep contentment in God and don't look to a bank account or a romance or to politics for our hope, a people who embody a completely different life. And he intends for our saltiness and our lightiness, if you want to use that word, lightiness, to literally change the world. Now you may be saying out there, like, really? Jesus really expects us to as a little Prince Street church to go change the world? Well, remember who he's talking to here in Matthew chapter 5. He's talking to the disciples and the followers here. Then these people were not the rich. They were not the powerful. They were not the elite. He was talking to average folks in the crowd around the Sea of Galilee. I want you just for a moment listen to how pastor and author Skye Jethani explains it. This pastor writes, he says it isn't that he expected each person to change the world through remarkable accomplishments. Rather, Jesus expected his undistinguished followers to be the source of the world's most essential ingredients. And that Pliny, who lived in the 1st century, commentated that there is nothing more useful in the world than salt and sunshine. That likewise, in a dark and deteriorating world, there is nothing more wonderful than simple people living as Jesus taught. Simple people living as Jesus taught. He goes on to say, the world does not need more ambitious Christians. Our world desperately needs more ordinary lives lived in rich communion with God. I love 2 of those quotes that the pastor says, that Skye says, that simple people living as Jesus taught. Ordinary lives lived in rich communion with God and with others. And that's my hope for our church. That's my hope for Prince Street Church. That we'd be simple people living as Jesus taught. That we would have ordinary lives lived in rich communion with God and with one another. I want us to be a church that helps us as a collective whole become the kind of salt and light community that Jesus desires. As we move into our new mission statement that we just created the other month, of our mission as Prince Street Church is to praise God, serve others, and cultivate disciples. And we start implementing this across the board throughout our church. It's my hope that we can become this type of community. A church that lives out the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. A church that is salty and full of light. Of course, there's so many ways that we're living this out. VBS, just the other week was probably a good example of that. But we need to make sure that we root out the things that hinder us in this. Whether it be a focus on trying to be big for the sake of being big, or a focus on just knowledge instead of growth, or else maybe even having a consumeristic approach to our faith, or even something I didn't even mention today. We need to root that stuff out. Of course, I'm not saying that we have any of those things, but if we do, we need to kick those things to the curb. And today, I have a few questions I want you to wrestle with as you consider what it means for us to be a salt and light community together, and for you to be a part of one. And so I'm going to leave these questions up on the screen after my message is done, because I really want you to take some time to prayerfully reflect on these questions as it pertains to you as an individual follower of Jesus, and for you to be a significant part of our church family here at Prince Street Church. So the first question I have for you, I mentioned the researcher George Barna's quote where he says, "American Christianity has largely failed since the middle of the 20th century because Jesus' modern-day disciples do not act like Jesus." And so really the big question out of all this is, where have you seen examples of this in yourself? Again, not saying that we need to be perfect, but in what areas in your life do you act more like the world around you rather than act like Jesus? And what areas of your life are more in line with the kingdom of the world and not with the kingdom of Jesus? And honestly, that's a great question to ask every single week in this series as we walk through the Sermon on the Mount. Second question I mentioned before, salt and light are both an inward composition and an outward display of Jesus and his kingdom. So I want you to think about what are some recent examples from maybe your Sunday school class or even our church being salt and light. Where have you seen us living this out, living out this idea of being salt and light here at Prince Street Church? And then finally, what are the potential opportunities for us to be salt and light in our Sunday school classes in our church right now? What's something that we can do within the next month to live out this call to be a salt and light community? Can we have things going on? We have some other things that we're going to announce soon that we're doing, but what are other things that we could do? Just even ordinary things that help us to be a light in our community. So I just want you to take some time today as this video ends and these questions just stay up on the screen. I want you to take some time to reflect, to spend some time in the quiet, to ask God to reveal these answers to these questions to you. To take some time in this silent prayer time to seek God's face about this call of us being salt and light to the world around us. Well, I hope this will be a beneficial time for you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, and God bless.